Laudetur Jesus Christus, and welcome to this episode, finally, of the Domestic Church for this week. Now, apologies again first because, of course, this should have aired on Monday, but as some of you no doubt are now aware, there was an outage across the internet, which meant that, of course, we couldn't broadcast to Facebook, neither could we broadcast from StreamYard, which is the platform via which we stream to everywhere else. So sadly, the Rosary and the Angelus, they didn't broadcast on Monday either. So apologies for that. But I was determined still to give this week's reflections. And so we transferred Monday's episode to today and this evening. Now, today's episode is entitled Crucifige me, meaning crucify me. And this, my brothers and sisters, really should be the simplest prayer that any traditional Catholic should have on their lips at all times. Crucifige me, crucify me. And this, of course, can be used both in prayer and in defiance. Crucifige me, crucify me. We might say it first as a prayer, asking the Lord to take us as an offering to himself, to say, crucify me, Lord, to let me be an offering of sacrificial love for you, as you were an offering of sacrificial love for me. But also, too, we may say it in defiance. We may say it in defiance of those persecuting us. We may say, crucify me. Again, because we know that to be crucified for Christ's sake will ensure and guarantee us eternal life. Hear these words of St. Peter, the Apostle. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice, insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. We are, my brothers and sisters, enduring, I know we say it every week, but interesting times. But it's important that during these times, and in fact we might say despite these times, that we as traditional Catholics are 100% certain of who we are and what our purpose is. Now, some of you may know that over the last weekend there was held in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, USA, a conference entitled Catholic Identity Conference. This was arranged by the Remnant and various other Unite the Clans traditionalist Catholics. And they're asking, I think, a very important question, and I hope they reflected upon it of themselves. For sure, the Catholic Church seems to be facing something of an identity crisis at the present time. Certainly, it would seem that those who are in the hierarchy, who would otherwise be generally assumed and relied upon to be identifiably Catholic, are speaking and behaving in ways that are quite contrary to Catholic praxis, Catholic belief, Catholic devotion, and Catholic discipline. There are a number of high profile in the public forum Catholics, so-called, who are manifestly endorsing and promoting policies in our politics that are wholly contrary, indeed antithetical, we might say, to the Catholic faith. And this, of course, is causing confusion, causing chaos. We're in a strange situation where people who seem to be publicly and scandalously contradicting church teaching are yet getting away with it, are supposedly still Catholics in good standing. And this, of course, ranges from politicians like President Biden or Speaker Pelosi or innumerable others, but also bishops and even the Pope himself. All seem to be adopting stances, seem to be making statements that to all intents and purposes are antithetical to what Catholicism is all about. And seemingly, they're getting away with it, despite often the hypocrisy of their statements, let alone the heresy or the apostasy that they infer or contain. So what is an orthodox, bona fide Catholic supposed to do in this situation, in these interesting times? Well, we have to make a stand. We have to make a stand. And we have to hold fast to what has always been believed everywhere and by all, despite and in spite even of anything that the hierarchy says or does. See, this is the ridiculousness of the situation today, that those who otherwise should be the custodians of tradition are not. Clearly and manifestly, they are not. And irrespective of their present or their recent statements, that only betrays a deeper problem pervading the church, and that has been around for a very long time. I mean, before the Vatican councils. Truth of the matter is, that there is clearly a diabolic influence within the church. Now, those of you who know me, those of you who are familiar with my teaching, know that I'm not given to controversy. I'm not given to conspiracies. I don't speak very often really about spiritual phenomena. But it's clear to me, it's taken some time, but it's clear to me that what's going on must be diabolic. It must be diabolic. That so many bishops, that so many prominent Catholics can be at odds with each other and over fundamental doctrines, dogmas, and disciplines. And the fact that those who are in error cannot seem to recognize their error. The fact that so many seem to be taken in by, or even oblivious to, ignorant, we might say, of the errors and the apostasy pervading the church, suggests to me that there is more than just a problem, more than just a human problem. For so much confusion and chaos to have manifested itself in such a relatively short space of time since the Second Vatican Council, that changes like the liturgy could be introduced so quickly and practically, I mean, almost overnight, and with so little resistance. Now, some might say, oh, well, surely this is indicative perhaps of the Holy Spirit. But how can it be? The Holy Spirit is not going to contradict himself. And yet clearly the Novus Ordo and various aspects of Vatican II are clearly contradictory to the perennial magisterium of the Church, to her doctrines and her discipline, and indeed her worship. Now, of course, as I said, and I will always say, Vatican II didn't come out of nowhere. We can see, even and despite supposedly orthodox, conservative theologically popes, this destruction of the liturgy began right at the beginning of the 20th century. Vatican II really, in many ways, was just a culmination of various things that have been accruing. And interestingly, to have begun sort of around the time, or indeed, in fact, we may say between the time of the strange conversation that Leo XIII overheard, supposedly between God and Satan, and then the apparition of Our Lady at Fatima and all that she said about Satan. One can see why so many contemporary mystics or recent mystics of the Church have referred to and spoken about a time of passion for the Church. That we are undergoing collectively a time of trial, a time of testing. So, all we can do is hold fast to tradition. And we must hold fast despite, as I say, whatever the hierarchy says. Now, a few years ago, of course, a certain archbishop named Marcel Lefebvre took such a stand. Particularly, of course, in 1988, when, without papal mandate, he consecrated 4 bishops as assistants for the Society of St. Pius X. For that, he was declared by John Paul II as schismatic and was supposed to have incurred an automatic censure of excommunication. Now, at that time, some who had been followers of Marcel Lefebvre left the Society of St. Pius X, were reconciled with Rome, and established a fraternity of priests dedicated to the patronage of St. Peter, and a commission was set up called Ecclesia Dei, named after the decree which included the excommunication, so-called, of Marcel Lefebvre and the 4 newly consecrated bishops. From then until now, the Ecclesia Dei Commission has looked after and the development of various subsequent traditionalist Catholic religious communities and priestly societies, all of whom were assured and guaranteed that they could use exclusively the so-called traditional missal and rites. I say so-called because the edition of the missal that was permitted to them was 1962. A missal that had been around or lasted, in effect, some arguably 5 years. 1962, of course, was the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. By 1965, it was all over, and an interim missal was published. So, almost practically, the 1962 missal had about 3 years of use. But of course, the 62 missal as well contained the butcherized version of Holy Week inflicted by one Annibale Brunini under the auspices of Pope Pius XII, issued in 1955. The rubrics for the 1962 were also changed, so that, for example, the various commemorations of concurring feasts on any given day, that was all stopped, so that only one collect would be used at Mass. There were various other rubrics as well. In other words, the 62 missal was itself a modernist revision of the Tridentine Mass, a very recent then revision. So it's rather ironic to refer to it as the traditional missal. There's very little really about the 1962 that is traditional in terms of the longer perspective of the Tridentine Rite. But anyway, these communities established by Ecclesia Dei, they were told they could use the 62 missal, And so they have done. Now, of course, recently, the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes, issued by Pope Francis I, now threatens the existence of those Ecclesia Dei communities. And in various places, of course, where once, under the provision of Benedict XVI, motu proprio Summorum Pontificum, various traditional Latin Mass apostolates have been established all over the world. Suddenly now these are threatened. Some have already been taken away. Now it seems a crunch time is facing those Ecclesia Dei communities. Now bear in mind that a large part of the reason for their existence was supposedly about obedience. Those priests who left the Society of St. Pius X to form the Society of St. Peter did so believing Marcel Lefebvre to be in disobedience, but that they would be obedient. And indeed, the polemics of such communities against traditional Catholics, like the Society of St. Pius X, like even the Sedificantes, like against the old Romans and others, has always been about, well, you have a schismatic attitude because you are disobedient to the Pope. Well, it would seem that some of the opening talks of the conference last weekend began with a discussion on the domestic church, and in particular on establishing home oratories, domestic home altars. Now, we've already in this series spoken about and covered that, but seemingly one of the first talks at this Catholic Identity Conference was about reverting to a catacomb existence. The traditionalist Catholics, in response to Traditionis Custodes, should create home altars or home chapels so that traditionalist Catholic priests could, in secret, offer the traditional Mass. Do you see here the glaring contradiction? For years, traditional Catholics have been accused of being schismatics for supposed disobedience. And now these traditionalist Catholics, supposedly obedient, are now advocating disobedience. Whereas before they mocked traditional Catholics for having to use domestic chapels, having to use hotel rooms, etc., for masses, now they're telling the faithful to create such places in order for them to disobey the current Bishop of Rome in order to maintain tradition. There's a contradiction here, isn't there? It's not just me. And then in which case the question we have to ask is, well, are they then intending now to make a stand for that which Marcel Lefebvre and the rest of us made previously? Are they now saying, are they now recognizing, as Marcel Lefebvre stated, that like oil and water, you cannot mix tradition and the new Mass and the new doctrines? Indeed, to take that analogy and apply it to the Ecclesia Dei experiment, we can see how for the last 30 years, or however long it is, since 1988, that they tried mixing oil and water together. They tried mixing traditional theology, traditional discipline, traditional devotion, traditional praxis, and the traditional Mass within the context of the Novus Ordo Church and hierarchy and spirit of Vatican II. But clearly, as Pope Francis makes clear in his motu proprio and in his accompanying letter to the bishops, what Marcel Lefebvre stated as true so many years ago: oil and water don't mix. You can shake them up, you can stir them up, but they will always split. And this, my brothers and sisters, is what we're seeing now. We're seeing the split of water and oil. But still, the question remains, how will these traditionalist Catholics maintain their hypocrisy? So seemingly, publicly and outwardly, they would say that they were being obedient to the Pope, to Traditionis Custodes, and whatever other document he may promulge to quell or eliminate the traditional Mass. They will claim publicly and outwardly obedience, but inwardly and secretly, they will be scurrying underground to domestic homes, to domestic chapels and home altars in order to continue to say the traditional Mass. How is this principled? Is this not still an attempt to perpetuate the mixing of oil and water? How long could this last? What has become apparent in recent years, we might say, observing the experience of the Society of St. Pius X, is that the truth of Archbishop Lefebvre's words have proved true for them. Remember that about 10 years ago, there was a movement, a possible reconciliation between the Society and Rome, facilitated by the benevolence of Pope Benedict XVI. However, nothing came of it because, mercifully, the Society would not sign off on Vatican II, would not sign the statement or doctrinal statement or protocol that was presented by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. They realized then for themselves, and we might say as a newer generation of SSPXers, but they came to realize for themselves that the intransigence of the previous generation, in fact, was the correct stance. And indeed, that the Archbishop was right. You cannot trust Rome. You must not make an accommodation with Rome. And so one wasn't found. Now, bizarrely, of course, since then, Pope Francis has granted faculties to hear confession and solemnize marriages to the priests of the Society of St. Pius X. This is a most unusual situation indeed, that despite their supposed canonical irregularity, nonetheless, they have been given faculties bizarre. But can you see why, as traditional Catholics, we are so wary, and why we must be so cautious, and why we cannot trust Pope Francis? You see, on the one hand, he grants faculties to those in an irregular canonical situation, and then turns round and slaps down those who are canonically regular and who likewise have an adherence to Catholic tradition. Confusion, chaos. It doesn't make sense. And as they say, there's only one author of chaos. There's only one author of confusion. Now, interestingly, we've passed the centenary of what the conversation that Leo XIII overheard and the message that Our Lady of Fatima gave concerning some permission for the diabolical to affect the church. And if we look at the past 100 years, we see where it is in that time period that the vast majority of what has affected the church has occurred. All the liturgical tinkering and changes, all the doctrinal and disciplinary changes, all these things all came in that famed period prophesied. So yes, I should say that those who held this Catholic Identity Conference, they indeed need to consider carefully what their Catholic identity is. Now, you may have picked up from my speaking about traditionalist Catholics and traditional Catholics that perhaps I suggest there is a difference. Well, I do suggest there is a difference. Traditionalist Catholics are those who I would refer to as the Ecclesia Dei Commission communities and orders. Traditional Catholics, I would suggest, are people like the Society of St. Pius X, like us old Romans, and like the Sedevacantists and other independent traditional Catholics. And what is the difference between us? Well, it's tradition. It's a principled stance. You see, traditional Catholics have had to endure decades of persecution by the church. We've had to establish chapels, churches, domestic oratories, provision for our clergy, etc., outside of the institutional hierarchy and structures. And this through considerable sacrifice, not just by, of course, the clergy, but too by the faithful. The dilemma, the dichotomy, the problem for traditionalist Catholics that they now face is, if the institutional hierarchy does indeed seek to cut them off at the knees, meaning to take away their traditional liturgy, to take away their reason for existing, what are they going to do? Have they the moral integrity and the courage to make a stand and sacrifice for the sake of the church by holding fast to tradition like the rest of us have? Will they become traditional Catholics? Now, I realize, of course, that for some who may have an appreciation for these traditionalist societies, etc., that what I'm saying may sound harsh. Well, it's certainly not as harsh as the calumnies that they have inflicted upon traditional Catholics for decades. Disparaging our ministries, our apostolates, for the impoverishment by comparison to their privileged status and condition materially, falsely accusing us of schismatic attitudes, etc. One has to ask the question, will they who began in betrayal continue in like fashion, only this time betraying their masters? As I say, that's what they seem to be talking about. That's what the general hubbub from their conference suggests, that they are going to secretly disobey. And as I say, that is not a principled stance. And frankly, however appreciable it may be when they say, oh, well, but we can't afford to, lose our houses, our seminaries, our rectories, our priories, our convents. One has to ask, well, but why not? Why can't you forsake all those? Why can't you make sacrifices? How is it honorable to be dishonorable. And remember, my brothers and sisters, that these apostolates, etc., make public vows. They take oaths of obedience publicly to the Holy Father, to the local ordinary, etc. What they're proposing is to continue to publicly make vows of obedience that they will then secretly disobey. This is not honorable. And this will not serve, just as their initial betrayal of tradition hasn't served them now. The question that must be asked of their priests is, why will you not be crucified with Christ? Crucifige me. Why will you not offer yourselves to be sacrificed with, in, and for Christ, for the sake of his church? Why will you perjure yourselves? Why will you discredit yourselves before heaven? Why will you endure corruption? And likewise, the same question may be asked of the faithful too, who support their apostolates and their ministries. What are you supporting? Why are you supporting? Oil does not mix with water. If you want tradition, come to tradition. If you want truly to be a warrior for Jesus Christ, if you want to truly be a faithful soldier, then you must become a traditional Catholic and forsake traditionalism. For such is proving itself to be a vainglory. To be a superficial veneer of traditional asceticism. It means nothing if a principled stance for tradition is not behind it. And this question and this motto and this prayer, Crucifige me, must be the raison d'etre of us as traditional Catholics. Surely we would rather be crucified with and in and for Christ, for the truth, than make an accommodation or compromise with that which is ultimately derived from evil. Lies, falsehoods, perjury, all such has no place among those who would pursue holiness and union with God. I know, and I appreciate, and I understand that the thought of not easily being able to hear Mass, to receive the Eucharist, or indeed to live a sacramental life, to not have easy access to these things, is a hard prospect. But if one truly wants to be saved, if one truly wants sacred tradition to persist, then one has to adopt a willing, sacrificial mentality like that of the early Christians. Now, in the early church, in the time of persecution, there were various different names given to those who adopted different positions in the face of the persecution. For example, there were the sacrificiati. They were those who voluntarily apostatized from the faith, who would deny Christ, and when presented with the incense, would happily burn it before the pagan idols. Yes, perhaps some of them caved in after pressure, after torture, after deprivation, but ultimately they denied Christ. The sacrificiati. Then there were the liberatici. The liberatici. They would pay officials to get a certificate to say that they had made the sacrifice even though they hadn't. And then there were the confessores and the martires, the confessors and the martyrs. So you had the sacrificiati, the liberatici, and the confessores and the martires. The sacrificiati would basically sell their soul rather than make a stand. The liberatici, who would rather bribe, lie, perjure. And then the confessors, the martyrs, the witnesses to Christ. And so the question we have to put to these traditionalist Catholics, which of these will you be? Will you be the sacrificiati? Will you deny tradition for the sake of holding your preferment? Will you deny tradition for the sake of holding on to your church building, to your convent, to your seminary? Or will you be like the liberatici? Will you seek back deals and nefarious compromises and accommodations to appear publicly and formally legitimate, but behave surreptitiously? Or will you become true confessors and martyrs for tradition? Will you make the sacrifices necessary? Will you make a principled stand for the truth? Will you hold fast to Christ, no matter what it takes? My brothers and sisters, traditional Catholics, we have a very grave and very great obligation at the present time to pray for our traditionalist brothers and sisters. We must pray that they will be given the courage and the strength, the resolve and the will to become true confessors and martyrs, true witnesses to Christ and his tradition. As much as we need pray always for ourselves and for each other to maintain our resolve, now in addition, we must pray for those who face this dilemma. And this may involve uncomfortable conversations. This may indeed accrue more calumny to ourselves. Yes, they will divide us, but at least we have integrity. At least we are maintaining a principled stance. And together we have hope. For one of the questions that many traditionalist Catholics pose is, well, how will this all be resolved? We don't know. But we do know that we must hold fast to Christ, that we must hold fast to truth, that we must hold fast to authentic tradition. For we know that by doing so, we might become to enjoy the company of those hundreds and thousands of saints who have gone before us, who received that tradition, cultivated that tradition, passed on that tradition, who were made saints, made holy by and through and with that same tradition. This is all we can hope for. Will an Orthodox Pope be elected in the future? Yes, why not? All things are possible with God. But that doesn't mean, meanwhile, that we should compromise with the truth. That doesn't mean that, meanwhile, we should dabble in doubt. Rather, we should hold fast to that which we know to be sound, that which we know to be efficacious for our salvation. Crucifige me, crucifige me, crucifige me. Sit nomen Domini benedictum, ex hoc nunc usque in saecula, auditorium nostrum in nomine Domini, qui feci caelum et terram, benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti descendet super vos, et maneat semper. Amen. Until next time, God bless. Take care of yourselves and others. And hold fast to Christ.